In early morning on July 1, 1916, thousands of British and French soldiers went over the top. This marked the beginning of the Battle of Somme. The battle, which will last for the next 4.5 months, a battle which will claim hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. It is estimated that overall casualties on all sides was over 1 million, which makes Battle on Somme as one of bloodiest in human history. First day of Battle of Somme will be marked as the worst day in British military history. By the end of the first day, 19,240 British soldiers will die, while more than 37,000 will be wounded, missing, or captured. Overall casualties of British Army will be 57,470 men, a 40% of all of them who went over the top that day. Casualties of officers were even worse. It is estimated that 60% of officers that day were killed or wounded. To make this tragedy greater, the battalions which formed the bulk of the attacking force that day, were formed mostly from volunteers from the same cities, neighborhoods, and villages from all over Great Britain. On the communities mostly affected with this tragedy, a first day of the Battle of Somme will make the permanent scar, which is felt to this day, 100 years later. The front on Somme sector was formed at the end of 1914. The sector was a relatively quiet, while main focus was on other areas of the Western Front, where great battles raged. This gave the Germans sufficient time to fortify their positions, which will play an important role in the battle, especially during the first day. Before the war, the area was a farmland, which in some places rose slightly, thus making the appearance of a wavy surface. These gentle elevations of the land, the small hills, were included in the German lines, heavily fortified, and turned into free-standing fortifications. Redoubts. Military maps at that time were filled with names such as Schwaben Redoubt, Hawthorne Redoubt, Leipzig Redoubt, etc. Fortification on these hills dominated the area. The view from them stretched far behind the British and French front lines, far enough away that the Germans noticed in time the gathering of attack force, with more than 300,000 British and French soldiers. Unlike the British, German, and French soldiers took part in the initial phase of the war. They had enough war experience as well as experience in the new conditions of trench warfare. The German trenches were remarkably well made. Almost each had a special, deeply buried room, in which soldiers could hide during the heaviest artillery bombardments. Often such rooms were so well built, that they could only be destroyed by a direct hit of artillery of the largest caliber. The British troops gathered for the attack were mostly volunteers organized into so-called PALS battalions. PALS battalions were formed by people from the same recruitment center. PALS battalions was the brainchild of Lord Herbert Kitchener, Secretary of State for War. Wanting to recruit a large number of people quickly, Lord Kitchener felt that people would rather fight if they were in a circle of people they already knew. In larger cities, battalions were composed according to occupations, so there were trade battalions, sports battalions, etc. This concept proved to be a very effective way of recruitment. By the end of 1914, more than 500,000 people had been recruited, mostly volunteers. In most cases, these were young men from the same cities, streets and neighborhoods, who very often shared school desks and who had known each other since childhood. These young men had high morale, they were eager to fight, however, they were poorly trained. Much worse than their rivals, at the other end of no man's land. The first day of the Battle of the Somme will also be the infamous end of the PALS battalion concept. The devastating blow that individual communities will receive, the grief that will loom over entire streets and cities, will force British recruiting officers to abandon this concept altogether. The Somme Offensive was agreed in December 1915, at a meeting of French and British military representatives at Chantilly Castle, as part of a coordinated offensive plan for 1916. The creator of this plan was General Joseph Joffre, the supreme commander of the French army. The Somme Offensive was planned for the summer of 1916, and was to begin in parallel with the offensives on the Eastern and Italian front. As the British Expeditionary Force held the front line northwest, from the North Sea coast, along the border with Belgium, to central France, and French forces were deployed on the southeastern part of the front, from central France to the border with Switzerland, the area around the Somme River was selected, because it was the point of contact of British and French forces. According to plan, the main strike of the offensive, in the area around the Somme River, was to be done by French forces, while British forces were to provide support to the French attack. However, this plan will change soon. On February 21, 1916, with the German attack, the Battle of Verdun began. The Battle of Verdun will last almost the entire 1916, and it will bound all the French army reserves. This meant that the bulk of the offensive on the Somme sector would be carried out by British forces. The realization of the plan now fell to General Douglas Haig, Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force. Haig tried to postpone the offensive for August or September of 1916. He thought that the British forces would not be ready for the offensive in June, and he also tried to gain some time for further training of his troops and strengthening of artillery. However, due to the very heavy position of the French army near Verdun, and the pressure of General Joffre, the implementation of the original offensive plan began in the second half of June, in order to relieve the French army of the pressure they were exposed in the battles around Verdun. The British Third and Fourth Armies, and the French Sixth Army were assigned for the offensive. The Fourth Army was to carry out a main strike on the central part of the front, while the Third British and Sixth French Army were assigned to advance and protect the north and south flank of the Fourth Army. A detailed offensive plan called for a Fourth Army under General Henry Rawlinson to advance through the center on a 25-kilometer-wide front, stretching from the village of Serra, in the northwest, to the village of Montauban, in the southeast, to break through the front and open the road between Albert and Pozières. The breakthrough, and the opening of the road from Albert to Pozières, was to be exploited by 3 cavalry divisions under the command of General Hubert Gough, to advance further towards the town of Bapaume, deep in the German rear area. To achieve this, the Fourth Army had to occupy, not just the first, but also the second line of German defense, which in itself was a very ambitious plan. In order to achieve the objective, it was decided that the infantry would attack in several waves, so that each attacking wave could take advantage of the successes of the previous one, and continue advancing. Unlike the Fourth, the Third British Army, under the command of General Edmond Allenby, and French Sixth Army, under the command of General Émile Fayolle, had less ambitious objectives set for the first day of the battle. The main task of the Third Army was to protect the left flank of the advance of the Fourth Army on the northwestern part of the front. Objective of the Third Army, for the first day, was to occupy the ledge in the German lines, at the center of which was the village of Gommecourt. The attack on the ledge near Gommecourt was carried out as a diversion, with the aim of diverting artillery fire from the main attack, and tying of the German reserves to the Third Army sector. The French Sixth Army had the task of guarding the right flank of the advance of the Fourth Army, on the northeastern part of the front, slightly wider than 10 kilometers. The targets for the first day of the Sixth Army were also modest and limited solely to occupying the first line of defense on the south side of the Somme River, and supporting British attack on the north side of the river. The area on the Somme sector was defended by the German Second Army, under the command of General Fritz von Below. Just like the French, the Germans were also heavily engaged in the battles around Verdun, with majority of their army, as well as almost all their reserves. The British and French preparations for the attack did not go unnoticed. German commanders knew by June that the attack on the Somme sector was only a matter of days. The German Second Army was stretched over a large area and with very small reserves, had nothing left to do but to strengthen its lines and wait for the attack. As already mentioned, the Germans occupied the area which would become the scene of the battle, as early as 1914. During that period, not only did they establish their first line, in which they included redoubts in strategic positions, but they also managed to complete their second and third line of defense. Numerous barbed wire obstacles were placed on the no-man's land, while the artillery prepared its maps and barrage sectors. Communication between the first line and the artillery batteries was established, and each commander, on the first line, knew exactly which artillery battalion covers his sector. German first-line trenches, in the main attack sector, especially around the villages of Thiepval, Ovillers, and La Boisselle, were located on top of gentle slopes, from which they had an excellent view and field of fire, but trenches in such a position were clearly visible to British artillery observers. They were easy target for artillery barrage. Artillery was to play a major role in a British plan. General Haig and General Rawlinson, commander of the Fourth Army, had different ideas on how to use artillery. General Haig believed that artillery preparation should be short, in order to achieve an element of surprise, while on the other hand, General Rawlinson advocated systematic and long-lasting artillery preparation, that was to last for several days. As the British did not have a sufficient number of artillery pieces, some of the cannons were given to them by the French, who had more than a sufficient number of artillery pieces. In the southern sector, where British and French forces merged, the artillery was exclusively French. General Rawlinson's idea prevailed. According to Rawlinson's plan, the artillery had several objectives. Smaller caliber artillery was assigned to destroy barbed wire obstacles on no man's land, while medium and large caliber artillery was assigned of bombing the first and second German line. A smaller number of larger caliber batteries were left to neutralize German artillery. On June 24, 1916, a 7-day artillery barrage fire began, as a gruesome overture, to the horror that would last for the next few months. In parallel with the plans for artillery and infantry actions, the realization of a secret part of the Somme Offensive began. Back in May, British engineers started to dig the tunnels towards German positions. The soil in the area was composed of chalk, a material ideal for digging the tunnels. A total of 19 underground mines were to explode on the first day of the offensive. 10 minutes before the infantry attack, on July 1, 1916, tons of explosives stored in underground tunnels under German defensive lines were activated. With a deafening noise, huge pillars of earth rose from the ground, taking hundreds of lives of German soldiers. One of those explosions, the one set in the tunnels below the Hawthorne Ridge, was filmed. That footage will become one of the symbols of the First World War. Tunnel explosions marked the beginning of the battle. Many craters of these explosions are still visible today, in the peaceful landscape, as a reminder of the events that took place more than 100 years ago.